This month's Timewatch explores the pleasures of studying two very different kinds of historical document. Research in record offices led a family historian unexpectedly back to the career of one of Britain's leading early musicians. But historic documents don't always consist of sheets of paper in archives. They come in many shapes and sizes, and sometimes when you least expect them. There's a peculiar historical fascination about models like this one of the famous Mallard locomotive, which broke the world speed record for steam in 1938, a record which still remains unbroken today. My main unfulfilled ambition as a child was to own a train set as big as this one. Actually, I was lucky enough to inherit a rather smaller Hornby set from my father. It never occurred to me at the time that Hornby trains would one day become historical documents. But that is precisely what has happened. When the enthusiasts of the Hornby Collectors Association get together, they're not simply continuing a childhood hobby. As our first film shows, they're also bringing to life the past achievements of British engineering and some of the social history of interwar Britain.
Yes, the first one. The first Hornby series label, yes. Very nice.
Equally good both sides.
Equally good both sides. They don't often come in that condition.
When British Rail as a whole went over to dieselisation and the steam trains went, I think one way in which a lot of us of our generation could keep up with the nostalgia of the past was by collecting the old toys with the names that we remember, yes. LNER, LMS, Southern, Great Western, and so on.
It was Webb's birthday yesterday, or did he go out? It was Romania, she was 50 yesterday.
I remember being very, very sad in 1947 when I heard about the nationalisation of the railways, not for any political reasons whatsoever, but just because everything would be standardised.
1920 to 1922.
You think it's 1920 to
1922. The 23 one is an oval.
Oh, yes.
And the 23 was never put on coaches. It was only used on goods vehicles, wagon vans, that's all.
Well, that surprises me, because I thought that would have been about 1924.
That's it.
Okay.
So, of course, 1924, there were LNER, LMS.
The four groupings.
That before the grouping.
Yes, of course. Well, that's fine. That's famous.
And that, of course, is a Caledonian coach, which is very rare.
Those are Caledonian coaches,
yes.
Even with the green roofs.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
That's interesting.
That's the original roof.
How rare is this one? Is it very rare?
Yes, that one is very rare. I understand that there's only one really mint condition, which is in the Toy Museum in London.
In London. Yeah.
And you can get these from time to time, but very, very rare in good condition. Yes. This is the best I've ever seen.
That's because of its great age, of course.
I think toy trains, they are the hardware, the icons almost of their youth. Railways were, to the children growing up in the 1920s and 30s, the way airliners were to the generation of the 60s and 70s. They were the new technology, or computers today. And as they evolved during the early 1930s into streamlined trains, was the great thing at that time, of course, they were very exciting. And a new locomotive, can you imagine, there would be a photograph on the front page of a national newspaper. I think in the future they'll be collected as objects, which are very direct reminders of a particular period. And the 1920s and 1930s are certainly going to be remembered as a very remarkable period, and the objects associated with that. Frank Hornby worked as a clerk in a meatpacking company in Liverpool, and then he had this idea, and he invented Meccano, basically as a toy for his children. And from that, in the turn of the century, grew Meccano Limited. And of course, Hornby Trains followed on after the First World War. His first notion was to build a Meccano type train, which would have been quite unique, that you could build up and take apart the way you could Meccano. And then obviously, as the railways became the great thing of the interwar years, he realized that people wanted regional railways in green and red or whatever colors the railways were to look like the real things, because railway travel was becoming very, very popular and very widespread. So he had to build models to respond to this demand for a sort of reality, a sort of scale appearance.
Yes, I think that's a nice station of its time. I particularly like the name, of course, John. Windsor, very patriotic. And of course the royal family changed its name to Windsor in 1917.
That's right.
For that reason, because they were a German-based family.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hornby was able to come in by 1920, producing the trains that everybody wanted to buy
yes.
British.
Yes, although DRGM, dirty rotten German make, was prevalent at that time, I think that Frank Hornby would have been preeminent anyway, because the quality of the stuff that he produced was far ahead of that of the Germans.
What I do think is that it would not have taken off as quickly as it did, or as well as it did, and the range grow as quickly as it did, had it not been for the anti-German feeling. I think it would have been a harder climb upwards, whereas it was immediate success with the first train came out.
Absolutely, and of course, on all the publicity, and including the boxes, the legend "British and Guaranteed" appeared.
Yes. Very important for the...
Very important for the times.
Yes.
Yes, indeed. Reflects the social history of the thing.
Yes.
Very effectively, I think.
Well, up to the First World War, toy trains, model trains in this country had almost exclusively been made in Germany. They weren't always labelled as such, but of course after the obvious emotional traumas of the First World War, it was quite difficult to sell German goods in the early 1920s. So Hornby trains, I think captured the essence. They were English in the sense that they were not too technical, but they had that sort of sense of majesty and pomp.
Hornby, like most other train manufacturers in the 20s and 30s and before, kept us up to date as they possibly could with every development that was going on. And so if cars changed, then the pictures of the cars had to change. If fashions changed, then the figures changed in order to make the differences in the fashion of the day and so on.
That machine there that makes the letters.
name-making machine.
I remember them. You just put a penny in and get 10 letters. You put a big handle in, and the slip of aluminium came out with your name on, or your sweetheart's name, whichever it is.
I think your aluminium was zinc, actually.
One of the things which was very characteristic of the real stations in the old days was that everyone had its own coal yard. And the wagons used to bring the coal in, and the lorries used to take it away. And it was a well-known sight to see shoveling of coal. Now, of course, you can do this with a Hornby train because you've got imitation coal, and you've got little lorries, and you've got wagons to put it in.
The reason they're there, though, isn't it, John? Because they were a part of station furniture.
They were a part of station
Whenever you went
furniture.
on a station, particularly in the country, there'd be a trolley with some milk churns or some milk churns waiting for the milk train to...
Later on, and this is reflected again in Hornby series, the glass line milk tank came into being, which virtually saw the end of milk churns on stations because it was bulk tanking. Hiking was to the early 30s as aerobics is to present day, except that it was much more healthy because it was done out of doors and aerobics is done indoors. But yes, it's the keep fit theme.
Look at the lady there with the child. I mean, she's very... well dressed.
She's dressed in the height of early 30s fashion, that lady. And there is another lady in the passenger series,
That's right,
Jim.
yes.
in a maroon coat with a dark brown or black fur collar and a little pillbox hat. Now, I have a photograph of my mother, and she is dressed exactly the same as that, and the coat was exactly the same colour as well, which is very strange.
All I can remember is that when I smell the smoke of a train now, as you do on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, it reminds me of the 1930s and going on holiday. That smell of smoke that used to creep into the carriages, even though the windows were shut, always reminds me of going on holiday in the 1930s. It was an exciting sort of smell, the smoke, and the clatter over the points. You ended up a little bit dirty sometimes. So I remember the waiting rooms, lovely waiting rooms. There were ladies and gents, all very separate. And they were always very hot. I remember them being very hot. They had a big black tortoise stove with a pipe up the top. Sometimes they got red hot. And they were a bit dangerous really, but it was lovely if you went in on a cold day to wait for a train in comfort by the side of this lovely warm stove. Yes, I do remember that very clearly. They were lovely.
I was enthralled by the model Pullman coaches, but I had never ridden in an actual Pullman coach until I was 12 years old, when my parents took me on holiday to Brighton. We travelled in a genuine, real Pullman coach from Victoria to Brighton on the Brighton Bell, and that was a thrill I shall never forget.
That's the 3 penny, yes. 3 new penny one. That would cost 3 new pennies.
3 new pennies.
Right at the other end of the scale.
Right at the other end of the scale.
It's very beautiful.
Absolutely. All hand-finished, look. Yes. Hand-lined, hand-finished, hand-transferred, even the doors open. Lovely coach, that. Neither of them, of course, to scale.
Oh, hopeless. Both running on the same track.
The same gauge, but not the same scale.
That's right, yes.
And there's a lesson in scale for you.
And then
in between, yes.
And then there'll be another.
That's right, yes.
A man's wages was roughly about £1 a week, 150 in the labouring community. So of course it was possible to bring a family up and buy toys of that sort of price.
When I was a kid, in the village I was brought up in, it was only the better off children that had these. I didn't have them, and I always said that I would get them, and by God I have. Haven't we?
My set reflects the 20s and 30s, absolutely. There's nothing on it that was manufactured after the war. And this is important to me because that is my era.
Are you following on that? Yeah, good. That's fine.
That's my head.
I think there are also reasons for adults wanting trains. Sometimes it's because they weren't allowed to have them when they were children. I think, too, there's a desire on the part of people who have a large stuff to be in control of an entity and to say, my hand's on the controller, I can make these trains go anywhere I want, I can put the signals up and down, the lights on and off and so forth, and you control a little world of your own. Well, parents were funny in those days. They seemed to think you ought to give up toys when you were about 15. And I wanted to carry on with trains. My father kept on at me. You ought to go in for more manly things, like sport. Well, of course, when the war came, I was called up fairly soon. And so things like that were put away. And mine were eventually sold.
I think the reason why people collect these things nowadays is because they do reflect the past, and there's a considerable amount of nostalgia about. I'm not sure that nostalgia on its own is a good thing, but when it is combined with a love of a product which has been beautifully made and made to last, that is a different matter. The items stand up in their own right, as little works of art.
The inside track's free, we can use that.
There you are.
Do you want me to do it for you?
Yes, please.
You've got to be careful that all the bogies get on, or else with derailment could be very expensive. Sometimes they go backwards and sometimes they go forward. There we go.
Very good.
How's that then?
That's fine.
Probably hasn't been run for quite a while, has it?
No, as I mentioned earlier, John Kitchen oiled it for me.
One of the things Frank Hornby was well ahead of his time about was advertising. He was a first-rate marketing man. The idea of the slogan, British and Guaranteed, and other slogans, made people be loyal to that brand. Also, he had dotted about his series wagons with advertisements on for things like biscuits and petrol and Coleman's mustard. And he also produced little advertisements to stick on station platforms that were just like the ones that you saw as you went around.
Hand finishing was something that the Hornby Company prided itself in. On the locomotives, the lining and the transfers were hand applied, and the operative always signed her signature underneath, initials that is, and we think that that was a form of quality control. All the operatives there, apart from the foreman really, were mostly women, all working in the Binns Road factory in Liverpool on manufacturing Hornby trains.
I get a lot of correspondence from Australia, from Canada, and they say, John, look, we can't get these trains over here. Send some over for us, you know. I won't do it. You know, keep them here. I take a little bit of O gauge, you know, but just the ones that are duplicated over here. But we're not going to let them have them, you know. We have a job to find them ourselves.
Certainly, when it came to 38 and 39, there were signs in the Hornby world that things were changing, and some of the brightly coloured things disappeared. It may have been because it reflected the ominous coming of the war.
The war, of course, ended the whole production of toy trains, and there were no materials. I think they went on making them about 1940, but there were just no more materials left, and Hornby went over to war work. And that was the end of an era, and they never came again. And during that period, of course, they reached their zenith. In the 1950s, it just gradually dwindled to a few sets that were offered in toy shops, not model shops. And then Hornby had all sorts of Hornby had to invest very heavily in its 00 range. And it got caught rather badly commercially because it had a 3-rail system, and then it had to retool for a 2-rail system. So effectively they died in 1939.
I did visit the place in the 70s when it was still in full production. It was quite a dreadful, noisy place, and there was buzzing with activity. People showing cartloads of Meccano around and conveyor belts full of toys. That was fine, but then they came on the closure bit. They suddenly, one Friday afternoon, went to all his employees and said, we're ceasing production, you're all redundant, as from 4 o'clock today. Ironically enough, over Christmas. And after Christmas, I had the opportunity of going into the factory, and it was just damp and still. And it was very like the Marie Celeste, cups of coffee half drunk. It was just as though people had just disappeared out of the place, and it was so sad. It was just, as I say, like the Marie Celeste, everything just evaporated.